Criminals are often willing to do anything to secure a lighter sentence, or, in the best-case scenario, avoid punishment altogether. But sometimes, their methods are so disturbing and repulsive that even seasoned detectives are left horrified. Today's story is about how police hunted down a master of deception and improvisation, a woman whose lies shocked all of Italy. Veronica Panarello was a young mother from Italy whose life, from the start, seemed to be one long series of challenges. At just 16, in a local bar, she met a 20-year-old man named Davide Stival. He was 4 years older, charming, and mature, and Veronica immediately fell for him. They began dating, and within 3 months, the teenage girl was already dreaming of starting a family. She told Davide she wanted a baby, and he agreed. Soon they moved in together, and before long, Veronica discovered she was pregnant. In 2006, she gave birth to their son Loris. She was only 17 years old, while Davide was 21. At that time, Veronica's relationship with her parents was extremely tense. The pregnancy outside of marriage only deepened the conflict. Still, she was determined to build her own family and prove everyone wrong. Eventually, the couple married, and Veronica soon became pregnant again. Their second son, Diego, was born a few years later. Despite their struggles, the Stivals seemed to live a simple but happy life. Davide worked hard as a truck driver, and Veronica stayed home, taking care of the children and the household. She was described as neat, loving, and devoted, and her sons adored her. However, people who knew her noticed something unusual. Her parenting often looked more like friendship than discipline. She was still very young, impulsive, and emotional, traits that sometimes made her clash with her own parents. The family lived in Santa Croce Camarina, a small Sicilian town with about 10,000 residents. It was a peaceful place where everyone knew everyone else. But on November 29th, 2014, this quiet community would become the scene of one of Italy's most shocking and tragic cases. Around 1:30 p.m., Veronica Panarello walked into the local police station, visibly agitated, and reported that her 8-year-old son, Loris, was missing. She told officers that she had driven him to school that morning, as usual, and dropped him off right outside the building. Afterward, she had taken her younger son, Diego, to kindergarten. When she returned at 12:30 p.m. to pick Loris up, he never came out. Panicking, she looked everywhere, the classrooms, the playground, the surrounding streets, but there was no trace of her son. So she came straight to the police to report his disappearance. Officers immediately went to the school, but no one, not teachers nor classmates, remembered seeing Loris that morning. He hadn't shown up to class at all. Some children thought maybe he had stayed home, while others assumed he had skipped school. No one, however, believed that the boy would have gotten into a stranger's car on his own. He was far too cautious and intelligent for that. That left only one terrifying question. If Veronica had dropped him off at school, and he was never seen entering the building, where had he gone? At the time, Davide, Veronica's husband, was working hundreds of kilometers away in Rome, driving his truck. When police called him, he was completely shocked. His wife hadn't even told him their son was missing. He immediately flew back to Sicily, desperate to find his family. But when he landed, he was met with a devastating update. A post on social media announcing that Loris had been found dead. Only 4 hours after Veronica's police report, Loris's body was discovered in a ravine near an abandoned mill just outside town. The boy had been dumped like trash, his life cut short in the most senseless way imaginable. The site where Loris's body was found was just a few minutes' drive from the Stival family home. It was discovered by an elderly hunter who often roamed that wooded area. During one of his regular outings, he noticed something unusual in the mud. As he got closer, he realized with horror that it wasn't garbage. It was the body of a small child. He immediately called the police. When investigators arrived, they found the boy's lifeless body twisted unnaturally in a shallow ditch. His pants were partially pulled down, and his underwear was missing. Right away, police suspected a sexual motive, perhaps the work of a pedophile. But something about the scene didn't fit the typical pattern. For one, the perpetrator had redressed the child after undressing him, something almost unheard of in such crimes. Predators often take clothing as trophies, but they rarely put the victim's clothes back on afterward. Moreover, there had been no similar cases in the region before. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small Sicilian town of Santa Croce Camarina. Parents were terrified to let their children out of sight. National news outlets picked up the story, and by nightfall, all of Italy was following the case. People demanded answers and justice, while police raced to find the monster who could have done such a thing. Detectives worked tirelessly, but something about the case was deeply unusual. The crime scene didn't match the behavior of a typical sexual predator. They began to look more closely at the family. Veronica and Davide had always seemed like a respectable young couple. Yes, they'd had their child early, but by all appearances, they were devoted parents. However, when police questioned Davide, they learned that he spent very little time at home. As a long-haul truck driver, he was often away for weeks, sometimes seeing his family only a few days each month. This meant that Veronica was alone most of the time, raising the children by herself. Neighbors mentioned that she had often complained about exhaustion and loneliness. Some even whispered about possible affairs, though no evidence was ever found. When officers visited the Stival home, they found Veronica in a terrible state. According to her husband, she was devastated. She cried constantly, refused food, and quickly became physically weak. She was later hospitalized and placed on 4 drips because of severe malnutrition. Detectives described her as looking hollow, pale, and broken, with dark circles under her eyes and a detached demeanor. At that time, their younger son, Diego, was sent to stay with his grandparents because Veronica was in no condition to care for him. Davide, meanwhile, quit his job to stay by her side. Despite the family's suffering, detectives needed answers. They asked both parents to accompany them to the ravine where Loris had been found, hoping the visit might trigger memories or useful details. The scene was recorded on video. In the footage, Veronica appeared almost ghost-like, as if the life had been drained from her. One of the first people to fall under suspicion was Orazio Fidone, the elderly hunter who had found the body. Investigators were puzzled by how he had managed to locate Loris only 4 hours after he was reported missing. Could it really have been a coincidence? They examined every angle, his background, his routines, and any possible link to the family. But Fidone passed a polygraph test, had a solid alibi, and there were no fingerprints or DNA linking him to the boy. Still, local gossip turned ugly. Rumors spread accusing Veronica of having an affair with Fidone's grandson, and even with the old man himself. But after rigorous checks, all suspicions were dropped. The hunter was cleared of any involvement. He truly had stumbled upon the body by chance. Meanwhile, the police were running out of leads. Weeks passed without progress. Finally, investigators from Rome were brought in to assist. Reviewing all the evidence, the new team began to focus on Veronica Panarello herself. They noted inconsistencies in her statements and a troubling detail shared by Loris's grandparents. The day before his disappearance, the boy had told them about a school experiment his mother had mentioned, one involving plastic cable ties. Loris said his mother had bought them for use at school. This seemed odd. Such items were not allowed in classrooms because they could be dangerous. When police asked the teachers, they confirmed that no experiment had ever been planned and no cable ties were needed. At first, investigators dismissed it as a child's confusion. But later, when the autopsy report came in, everything changed. The coroner determined that Loris had been strangled between 9 o'clock and 10 a.m. on the morning he disappeared. The cause of death was asphyxiation by a thin, tightening object, most likely a plastic zip tie. Suddenly, the boy's story about his mother's experiment didn't sound so innocent anymore. The forensic report also suggested that the killing had occurred near the site where the body was found. The injuries from the fall appeared to have happened either immediately after death or while the boy was still alive, implying that he might have been thrown into the ravine, possibly still breathing. Detectives suggested that the boy might indeed have wanted to get those plastic ties for some reason and made up the story about needing them for school. In that case, Loris would have been carrying them in his backpack when he went to class. But how could the attacker have known about them? It seemed extremely doubtful that the killer would assault the boy, grab his backpack, and start searching inside it for a potential murder weapon. Hoping that the missing item could still provide clues, the police blocked all the landfills that receive garbage from Santa Croce Camarina and began searching through the waste. It took several days of hard work, but the boy's blue backpack was never found. In addition to confirming the cause of death, strangulation, the forensic examination revealed another strange detail. The boy's pants were slightly pulled down, yet there were no signs of sexual assault or any traces of DNA from a possible predator. From that moment, detectives began doubting their initial theory. They were still looking for the killer, but now they realized that he was not a typical maniac or molester. This no longer looked like a random act of violence. It seemed personal. Still, at this stage, the information was too confusing to create a clear portrait of the murderer. The most obvious next step was to retrace the route that the mother and child had taken on the day of the tragedy. Although Santa Croce Camarina was a small provincial town, Veronica and Loris had driven along the main street, where many houses and stores were equipped with surveillance cameras. Collecting and reviewing all the footage took a lot of time. The police were hoping to spot a third person, perhaps someone following them in a black Volkswagen Polo, which a witness had mentioned. But despite hours of viewing, they found nothing unusual or suspicious. There were, however, several strange details. Most notably, there was no footage showing Loris entering the school. Despite Veronica's repeated claims that she had dropped him off almost at the door, it became clear that she was lying. They had never reached the school that morning. Dozens of hours of recordings were reviewed, but only her younger son was seen getting out of the car at the kindergarten. As investigators continued analyzing footage from around the area, they noticed something peculiar. At one intersection, Veronica's car turned toward a small church, located near the very ravine where her son's body would later be found. This was odd, since for years she had always taken a different route. Why would a young mother suddenly change her usual path, and on that particular day, the day her son would be found dead nearby? The discovery raised serious suspicions. At this point, detectives decided not to confront her with what they knew, so as not to scare her. Instead, they began quietly considering Veronica as their prime suspect. The experienced investigators wanted to test her honesty, so they asked her to retrace the same route she had taken that day, showing it to them step by step. They already knew the real route from the surveillance videos, but they wanted to see how she would behave. Veronica agreed, and the reconstruction began. When the police car reached the crucial intersection where she had changed her route, the young woman lied again. She claimed she had followed her usual road. It was now obvious that she was deliberately hiding something. From that moment on, she became the main suspect. Detectives decided to search the Stivel family home and took Veronica in for questioning. Realizing that the police considered her a possible murderer, the woman began protesting. She insisted that she would never harm her own child, but the officers no longer believed her. The interrogation lasted several hours. Veronica stubbornly repeated that she was innocent. During the conversation, however, she admitted that she had dropped her son off a few hundred meters from the school because she was in a hurry and believed he could walk the rest of the way on his own. According to her, someone must have attacked him on the road. When asked what she was doing near the ravine that morning, the same place where her son's body was later found. Veronica denied ever being there and claimed she didn't even know the area. But this was another lie. Her sister confirmed that they had often played there as children and knew every inch of that place. Surveillance footage also placed Veronica's car near the location that morning. Investigators had to go through the videos again to make sure their suspicions were correct and to look for more clues. They even brought in the boy's father, Davide, to help with identification. At first, he refused to believe his wife could be involved in their son's death. But as he watched the footage, he recognized her. He saw his wife leaving the house with both children in the morning, then returning without Loris. It was clear that she had never taken him to school. According to the police timeline, around 9 in the morning Veronica drove back home, backing into the garage instead of parking in front of the house, as she usually did. That was when she disappeared from camera view. Investigators believe that this was when the boy was killed. He had not gone to school and remained at home. When Veronica pulled into the garage, she likely did something out of sight of the cameras, something that she wanted to hide. Everything pointed to her intentionally concealing the truth. When confronted, Veronica continued to deny everything. She insisted that she had dropped off her older son at school, then took the younger one to kindergarten and returned home to do chores. She maintained that someone must have kidnapped Loris near the school, but the detectives didn't believe her. They had seen the footage showing that at 9:23 a.m., Veronica left home again, and just 2 minutes later drove down the road leading to the old mill, the same road where the boy's body would later be discovered. She returned home at 9:38 a.m., this time clearly alone. Considering how quickly everything had happened, the boy must have already been dead when she dumped him in the ravine. By 9:41 a.m., Veronica was on her way to her regular cooking class, which started at 10. She had left early, so as not to be late and not to arouse suspicion. There, no one noticed anything unusual about her behavior. She looked and acted as she always did. GPS data from her phone and car confirmed the route the detectives had reconstructed. But unfortunately, at that point, the police still didn't have enough hard evidence to formally charge her. They continued gathering information while keeping the woman under arrest. There were still no witnesses, no physical proof, and no video showing how the mother killed her own son. It seemed that the police were about to expose the murderer, but unexpectedly, a female officer who had been on duty near the school came forward. She claimed that she had seen Veronica drop her son off in front of the school on the morning of the murder. However, detectives didn't take her testimony at face value. Her statement directly contradicted the surveillance footage, which showed that Veronica had taken the same route she followed every day, performing her usual routine. It was entirely possible that the officer had simply mixed up the dates. At that time, the young mother was already behind bars, loudly protesting her innocence. Yet a small seed of doubt had been planted. When the investigators told her husband about Veronica's lies concerning the route she took that morning, he too began to side with the police. He admitted that his wife's behavior had seemed strange. Detectives realized this was the perfect opportunity to gain evidence. They knew that the suspect trusted her husband more than anyone else. So they decided to send him to visit her in prison, hoping he could get a confession or at least new details about what really happened. In truth, Veronica was the only person who had a complete picture of that fatal morning. Davide agreed that the plan made sense, but he said he did not want to be the reason for her conviction. He simply wanted the truth. He was allowed to visit her privately, without any obvious monitoring devices. On January 6th, 2015, 1 month after their son's death, Davide met with his wife in prison. By law, he wasn't normally permitted to enter the facility, but the police made an exception in hopes of solving the case. When he arrived, Veronica didn't even greet him. The first thing she did was ask whether he was wearing a wire. Davide denied it and showed her that he wasn't. There really was no recording device on him. It wasn't necessary, as the entire meeting was captured by the prison's security cameras. During the conversation, Veronica once again insisted that she had nothing to do with her son's death. She stubbornly repeated her version of events, telling the same story she had told the police, her lawyer, and her relatives. She had driven her son to school and had no idea what happened afterward. The detectives still couldn't prove her guilt. Even her motive was unclear. Everyone who knew her described Veronica as a decent woman who deeply loved her children. Of course, there were many rumors, but all of them were checked and found to be false. She truly seemed to be a caring mother. The only theory that made any sense to investigators was that she had suffered from depression or emotional instability. The main suspect was indeed in a fragile mental state, and her time in prison only made it worse. The investigation had reached a dead end when detectives came up with a new idea. They decided to let Veronica visit her son's grave, hoping the emotional moment might trigger a confession. She was transported there in a police car with flashing lights, as if they were escorting a dangerous criminal. The officers had planted a small listening device on the gravestone, certain that if left alone with her child, the mother would apologize or admit to the killing. Veronica did start talking, but not in the way anyone expected. She prayed, crying and begging her son to tell her who had done this, promising that she would make sure the person responsible would be punished. This stunned the investigators, who had been waiting for a confession. Afterward, she was placed back in the police car for the trip to prison. Somewhere along the way, she told the officers that she had experienced a kind of revelation at her son's grave. She said she had begun to remember fragments of that tragic morning, memories that had previously escaped her, and she wanted to talk about them, but only with her husband. On November 6th, 2015, Davide visited Veronica again. Like all prison meetings, it was recorded. This time, the main suspect confessed something new. She remembered that she hadn't taken her son to school at all that day. She said it was hard for her to explain because she had been in a strange state that morning, as if disconnected from reality, trapped in a fog. From the fragment she recalled, she described dropping her younger son off at daycare and then returning home, where Loris was supposed to be. She said she had left him there because he didn't want to go to school, but when she got back, he was gone. In her confused state, she assumed she must have already dropped him off earlier, only realizing her mistake later, when she went to pick him up and discovered he wasn't there. The police didn't believe this new version, but they knew they were getting close to the truth. It was almost the confession they had been waiting for all year. Her claims of memory loss seemed like an attempt to lessen her guilt, though some experts thought her mental condition might indeed be unstable. Unfortunately, her younger son was still too young to give any meaningful testimony about whether he had seen his brother that day. Despite being convinced of Veronica's guilt, the investigators decided to play along with her. They took her back to the family home, hoping that being in familiar surroundings might unlock more memories. They guided her through each room, asking her to recall what she had done there on the day of the murder. When she entered Loris's bedroom, something unsettling happened. She began speaking in a childlike voice, pretending to be her son, reenacting their supposed conversations from that morning. The detectives watched in disbelief. Her emotionless behavior convinced them that they were dealing with a pathological liar and manipulator who had managed to deceive everyone for over a year. Dozens of specialists had spoken with Veronica during the investigation, but none had managed to expose her deception. Even her lawyer believed that she truly suffered from psychological disorders that might explain her actions. Eventually, Veronica told a new version of events, one that many still believe today, although investigators doubt its accuracy. According to her account, she had returned home after dropping off her younger son and started washing his bottles. Her older son, Loris, had stayed home because he didn't want to go to school. While she was busy with household chores, everything seemed quiet. But when she entered his room some time later, she found his body, lifeless and turning blue, with plastic zip ties wrapped tightly around his neck. According to Veronica, the boy had been playing with the ties and had linked them together like a necklace. Thinking he could open them by pulling on one of the ends, he only made them tighter, unknowingly creating a deadly trap for himself. The mother knew how the plastic ties worked, but she also knew she couldn't tear them apart with her bare hands. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed a pair of scissors. When she returned and cut through the deadly loop, the boy was already lifeless, unconscious and not breathing. According to Veronica, she had a panic attack. She immediately picked up her phone and tried to dial the emergency number, but her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't press the right buttons. The numbers blurred before her eyes, and she never managed to call for help. At that moment, Veronica realized that everyone would blame her for what had happened. In a state of hysteria and fear, she decided to get rid of her son's body. Later, the forensic examination confirmed that there were scratch marks on the boy's neck and face, the kind that would appear if he had desperately tried to tear off the zip ties with his own nails. Unfortunately, they had been pulled too tight, cutting deeply into his skin, and he couldn't remove them. It was also possible that he had pulled one of the ends himself, tightening the noose even more and cutting off his air supply completely. At that point, detectives decided to re-examine the case and possibly awaken more memories. They brought Veronica and Davide back to the place where Loris's body had been found. There, the mother admitted that she had indeed thrown her son's body into the ravine, but she still denied killing him. She couldn't explain why the boy wasn't wearing underwear, which didn't fit into her story at all. Nor could she explain why such a clever 8-year-old would put zip ties around his neck, pull them tighter and tighter, and never call for help. Later, Veronica claimed that the ravine was very deep and that the boy's pants must have slipped down as the body rolled to the bottom. In court, the prosecution tried to dismantle the mother's version completely. Her behavior that morning seemed far too deliberate. For example, she had parked the car in the garage, something she had never done before, making it easy to load the body unnoticed. Yet according to her story, at that moment, she couldn't have known her son was dead. To the prosecution, this pointed to premeditation. The defense insisted that Veronica hadn't killed her son, that he had accidentally strangled himself, and that she panicked afterward, terrified of being blamed. Still, she couldn't answer one key question. Why had she removed her son's underwear and then put his pants back on? Veronica said she couldn't remember doing that. The prosecutor argued that it was an attempt to stage the crime scene to look like a sexual assault, hoping the investigation would go in the wrong direction. At first, the plan worked. The police were indeed searching for a sexual predator, but later they realized it had all been staged. During the trial, an unexpected twist emerged. Veronica claimed that it wasn't she who had killed her son, but her father-in-law, Andrea Stivel. She said they had been having an affair, and that on that day, Loris had caught them together and threatened to tell his father. In a fit of rage, the boy's grandfather allegedly strangled him. Despite how strange this sounded, investigators were forced to verify the claim. They reviewed the surveillance footage again and found that no man had entered the house that morning. However, in one of the recordings showing Veronica's car leaving home around 9:30 a.m., a dark shape could be seen on the back seat. Specialists were brought in to analyze the video, but they confirmed it wasn't a person, just a reflection on the car's window. Andrea Stivel completely denied the accusations, calling them the lies of a deranged woman. He had a confirmed alibi, and there were no messages or calls between him and Veronica that would indicate any kind of affair. His name was cleared, and no one believed her story. Veronica's behavior increasingly convinced investigators that they were dealing with someone mentally unstable. Officers noted that during interrogations she would suddenly start singing, or her calm, steady speech would turn into incoherent mumbling. She often stared blankly, as if slipping in and out of reality, and even mimed smoking an invisible cigarette. Her mother later testified that Veronica had long suffered from psychological problems. She had been sexually assaulted by several boys at the age of 14 and had attempted suicide by drinking bleach after a fight with classmates. The following year, she tried to hang herself in a greenhouse and spend time in a psychiatric clinic. She once even called her mother begging to be taken home, claiming a male nurse had assaulted her, but the accusation was never confirmed and few believed her. A psychiatric evaluation conducted during the trial determined that Veronica was not insane. She had acted with full awareness and control, displaying calculation and composure. The trial dragged on for 4 years due to numerous appeals and new investigations. In the end, Veronica Panarello was found guilty of premeditated murder and concealing her son's body. The court sentenced her to 30 years in prison. When the verdict was read, another disturbing scene unfolded. In the courtroom was Andrea Stivel, the grandfather she had accused. Veronica stood up and once again began shouting accusations at him, repeating the same absurd story. She had to be removed from the courtroom. To this day, she remains in prison, guarding the horrifying truth behind the death of her 8-year-old son, a truth that perhaps will never be fully known. Most investigators who worked on the case are convinced that it was not an accident, but a deliberate, cold-blooded murder. They believe that on that day, when Loris refused to go to school, something he had done before, his mother lost control, strangled him in anger, and later removed his underwear to mislead the police. Since she had purchased the zip ties in advance, it might even suggest that the crime was premeditated. After the trial, the boy's father, Davide, said that his life had been destroyed. In a single moment, he had lost his son, his wife, and his job. He still isn't sure whether Veronica truly killed their child. He insists he never saw her act violently toward the children. She had always been a caring mother. Now he tries to live for their younger son, raising him with the help of his parents.